So the recording has begun. I'm going to highlight you there or spotlight you, Eric, so everyone can see you. And I will join you just for the moment. So let me add that. Okay. Hello, everybody. I am David Kramer. I'm the director of the library at the Jewish Theological Seminary. If you've been here before, you know that I always begin by saying it's my pleasure and privilege, and both of those things are true, for us to be able to sponsor our book talks of books of Jewish interest. And there is no doubt that this evening we've got a distinguished author, a distinguished professor of English and journalism at Brooklyn College, right? Do I have that right? Yes. And a longtime journalist, commentator, someone who has offered critical perspectives on a wide variety of topics, political and otherwise. And I don't know about you, but I have followed his commentary closely and always appreciate the challenge that your voice represents. It's always wonderful. You know, I was thinking, Eric, do you recall when we first met? I don't, so I was trying to recover.
I think we met when you were teaching the Alter Cockers, and I was invited to join a biblical class that was started by Vicar Navasky.
That's right. Yes. I didn't remember if it was before that, but I think you're probably right. And you belonged to that class for a short period of time, I think it was, right?
Couple of years, I think.
Yeah. No, that's great. We miss you. I still teach that class.
Oh, you do?
Yeah. In any case, we've got tonight Eric's presentation of a very, very important book. We Are Not One: History of America's Fight Over Israel. There could not today be a more important topic to the broader Jewish community and to those beyond, American citizens who are concerned with the alliances of this country and the complications thereof. Needless to say, there are many complications in this relationship, and we look forward to hearing about it. Just before we begin, a couple of ground rules, please. Stay on mute. I promise if you stray off of mute, I will find you and mute you, excuse me. In addition to that, please do not use the chat for comments during the talk. As someone who speaks this way myself often, the chats that come through can be very distracting to the speaker. So out of courtesy to the speaker, please don't do that. But if you have questions, the questions please do put in the chat, either during the presentation or near the end. And I will handle all the questions. I will take them off of the chat and share them with Eric when the time comes. So I hope you all are challenged and enjoy this. And Eric, please go right ahead.
Thank you so much, David. I'm thrilled, really. You probably hear that a lot, but I'm thrilled to be here. Like I imagine many of you, since the beginning of the pandemic, I searched the internet for lessons and seminars, mostly having to do with Judaism, and I found, many Jewish organizations, Jewish shuls in England, in the United States, many Jewish studies programs at various universities, and I have to say, my favorite are the ones that JTS offers. I just finished, maybe some of you did, the series on censorship in Jewish history. It was terrific. In fact,
thank you so much.
David will attest to the fact that I asked him to please send a fan letter to one of the people who gave it. And I've begun the new one on liminality, and I owe a lot to JTS. So I don't know if I'm paying it back or I owe more as a result of tonight. Last week I went to a choral concert by cantors around the corner of my house on Shehesed. So I'm grateful to be here. I noticed also, usually when I talk, I set the camera so that you only see books. But I see that I have a picture up here, a photograph of, that's David Ben-Gurion looking through a foxhole in the 1948 war. So it's kind of appropriate. I bought that in Jerusalem many years ago. Anyway, listen, I wrote this book. I didn't expect anyone, literally anyone, to agree with all of it. My mother's not as sharp as she used to be. She might have agreed with it because I'm her son, but she wouldn't be able to today, unfortunately. And I don't expect anyone here to agree with it. I wrote it. I have strong feelings, and I have a history with Israel and Judaism, of course. I tried to write it as a historian rather than as me. There were times where I could have quoted my Zeta. I could have quoted a lot of experiences that I've had, but I left those out by and large. Because there are a few reasons I wrote this book. The two main ones are the fact that, leaving out personal reasons, which I'll get to in a minute, actually. But the justification for this book, 512 pages, are two. One, that everything about Israel, particularly Israel, Palestine, is very complicated. And you can't do justice to it except in taking your time and your space. And they're so rare, it's so rare that we have the opportunity to do that in our current discourse, which is driven by social media and things like Twitter and Instagram, whatever that is, TikTok. And so I really wanted to lay out the complications of everything, in part because sometimes when you make a criticism of Israel, it can sound anti-Semitic if you're not careful to explain all the various, again, complications and contextual information that's necessary to explain why something can be happening. And if you just say it quickly, it sounds like you're making a kind of accusation that you absolutely are not interested in making. So I needed a book for that. And fortunately, I haven't seen anybody accusing me of, pulling anything out of context in order to make that accusation. I kind of expected it, but hasn't happened yet. The second reason I wrote the book, second reason I think the book was necessary, not necessarily why I wrote it, but necessary, is that I have found, I've written a lot about Israel. I was a columnist straight through for the past 30 years, I've been told last week, actually. And I've written many columns on Israel. And I have found that even though I try to present my evidence whenever I make a statement, whenever I make an assertion, it's really impossible to change anyone's mind when you're discussing Israel, or much less arguing about people, unless you share exactly the same assumptions as someone else. They tend to be able to assimilate anything you say into what they believed previously. In part because when you're arguing about Israel, you're not really arguing about an issue, you're arguing about someone's identity. That Israel has become people's intensity on the issue is driven by the fact that you're talking about them. And I imagine that's true of a lot of people here on the pro-Israel side, but it's become almost as true for people who are anti-Israel, that they just can't listen. They're just waiting for you to finish so they can come back with their, what I call whataboutist arguments. So again, I thought it would be useful to have a book with thousands of sources that gives people what I think is I won't say objective, but a fair, in fact, I'll use the phrase fair and balanced, a phrase that's been ruined in recent decades, reading of what happened and why it's so difficult to discuss. So so those are the arguments for why the book is necessary. Why I wrote it is in some ways personal. And this is something else having to do, I guess, with JTS slightly. I was ruined. My Judaism, my Jewish education ruined me. It was typical suburban Hebrew school. I barely made it through in time for my bar mitzvah. I was made a Zionist by my parents sending me to Israel as a teenager a couple times. But it wasn't until I was in my 30s that I took an adult education class given by a Chavara in Washington called Fabrongen, taught by a rabbi named Max Tickton, who was also a professor. He was head of Jewish studies at GW. And that was a sort of gateway for me to learn about Judaism that I had never heard of before. no one had ever mentioned the rabbinical literature. It was fascinating to me. And then I went and got my doctorate in history. I'm a professor of English, but my doctorate's in history at Stanford. And I minored in Jewish studies, and I mostly studied Jewish history, but I also audited an undergraduate class in sociology and religious studies by a faculty member who, very unknown to most people, by the name of Arnie Eisen. And ironically, not only did I learn a lot auditing that undergraduate class, but what was funny about it is that the Hebrew school I went to was part of a Reconstructionist synagogue that my parents had joined. And it turned out I was a Reconstructionist, and I had never heard about it before until I studied it in graduate school. So I am in the debt of Rabbi Tickton and Arnie and later on many other rabbis who have opened for me what has been the most fruitful topic of study that I've ever encountered, even though I wasn't trained as a Jewish historian, which I think is okay for the purpose of this book, because this book is really about discourse. It's about arguments. And my training as a historian of American foreign policy and my 40 or so years writing about the media, I think put me in a good position to write this book that I think is unique in that no other book, there are a million books about Israel and Palestine, but there's no other book that's about the argument in the United States over Israel. And I think it has enormous implications, both for American Jews and for American democracy. And that's what I try to walk one through as they read this book. The book begins, well, it actually begins with Harry Truman recognizing Ben-Gurion's declaration of the state in 1948, 11 minutes after it was declared, but then it steps back to the beginning of the modern Zionist movement with Herzl and the Basel Congress. And I guess I should, before I go on further, I want to talk as little as possible, which is very unusual for me. I suppose it's unusual for most academics, but I'm really excited to have the audience that I have, and I really want to spend as much time in conversation as we can. So I'm just going to sort of give you bullet points of how I think the book is organized, and then hope that we can talk about it. But one thing I think is worth explaining is the title. We Are Not One. It has three meanings. One meaning is, one implication is that Israel and the United States are not one. They're not the same country. They don't have the same interests. One is a tiny little country surrounded by unfriendly states, mostly unfriendly states in the Middle East, and the other one is a global superpower surrounded by two oceans. And they're naturally going to have different and sometimes conflicting interests, something that is frequently denied by defenders of Israel, neoconservatives and leaders of American Jewish organizations. I found this quote that I love from Nancy Pelosi as recently as 2018. She said that if the US Capitol ever crumbled to the ground, the last thing that would remain would be our support for Israel, which is a kind of funny thing to say because, you know, it's a different country than the one she's the Speaker of the House of.
Please speak louder.
Sure. Sorry. Is this better? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. The second meaning of the title is that Israeli Jews and American Jews are very different people. They have very different kinds of experiences. Growing up in Israel is nothing like growing up in the United States. And there's a million reasons for this. So it may be surprising in some of the ways that they have come to diverge, but it's not surprising at all that they do diverge. And the slogan of the Zionist movement, "We are one," is a slogan. It's not a description of the Zionist movement in terms of its supporters in America and the people who enacted Israel. And the third implication of it is American Jews are not one. They never have been. There've always been enormous, two Jews, three arguments. It's an old story. But it's never been quite as intense as it is today in terms of the differences, particularly over Israel, but not only over Israel, that divide American Jews. So, so the idea that the rhetoric that is often used when discussing American Jews in Israel is completely inaccurate, and that's the ways in which it's inaccurate and the implications of that inaccuracy are what I'm trying to get to the bottom of. Okay, so I'm going to walk us through as quickly as I can. Just going to sort of signal the different eras that I think that American Jews and Zionism and Israel have gone through. And then I hope we can make this more of a conversation than a lecture. And I imagine most of you who would sign on to this are familiar with most of this, but not all of it. So one thing that many people aren't aware of is that most American Jews were anti-Zionist for the first 30, 40 years of the Zionist movement. German Jews, who were almost exclusively Reform Jews, were quite anti-Zionist, explicitly anti-Zionist. They insisted consistently that America was their Zion, and they were always very nervous about the American Protestants not trusting their commitment to this country and their patriotism. The very idea that Jews were a people rather than a religion, they felt was threatening to their status as upstanding patriotic Americans. When the Eastern Europeans started coming here and overwhelmed the German Jews in number, there were about 250,000 German Jews here when about 2 million Eastern European Jews showed up between 1880 and 1924. The Eastern European Jews were much more sympathetic to Zionism because they had relatives who had made the trip to Palestine, and also the United States shut its doors in 1924, and a lot of those Jews need to get out. Louis Brandeis was absolutely crucial in transforming the American Zionist movement when he came up with the idea that American Jews didn't need a Zion, but other Jews did. And therefore, to be a Zionist in America was to support other people's right to go to Israel, but that we didn't really need to concern ourselves except to support them in doing so. The name of that chapter is Zionism for Thee, but Not for Me. And this turned American Jews, the German Jews were still remained pretty uncomfortable with it. And they were quite powerful in terms of their controlling of the institutions of American Jewry, particularly the American Jewish Committee. So there was kind of a tension there. And this went on for quite a while. There was support for the upbuilding of the Jewish community in Palestine, but there would have been very little support for if they had said that they wanted a state at that point. The idea of a state of Israel came into play quite late in the game. It obviously grew out of it was consistently, the more one learned about the Holocaust, the more support statehood got from American Jews. There's a lot of controversy among historians as to whether or not the support for Zionism detracted from attempts to try and save American Jews, save European Jews. Most people would argue that it was hard to figure out what they could have done to save American Jews, but also there was an idea that there was something shameful about what was happening in the Holocaust. And American Jews themselves were shamed by how little they could do, how afraid they were of upsetting the Gentiles, how they were not willing to argue with President Roosevelt that Jews should be allowed to come to America. And the Zionists were thrilling. They were creating a new Jew. They were, making the deserts bloom. They were they rejuvenated Hebrew. They were writing poetry. They were making love. They were soldiers. They were poets. They were philosophers. It was wonderful. the first Jewish Commonwealth in 2,000 years, and it gave people hope for a Jewish future that seemed impossible to think about, impossible to imagine just a few years earlier. Again, something else people don't really have a good handle on, as far as I can tell, is that after the state of Israel was founded, and by the way, the embrace by American Jews of the fight for the state of Israel is really something to behold if you look into it. I think it was the largest lobbying campaign in all of history. The State Department was against it, the Defense Department was against it, CIA was against it, but the American Jews were so strongly behind it that President Truman, he had a lot of reasons to decide to recognize Israel, but the politics of it were all in one direction. There were more than one town in the United States that sent more postcards to the White House or the Congress than they had people in that town. And of course, the amount of money donated was fantastic. But again, there was this weird period, or weird from our perspective today. After 1948, American Jews lost interest in Israel by and large. They may have marched in parades. They may have collected money for JNF on Halloween instead of UNICEF for kids, whatever. They may have paid to plant trees, but they didn't identify themselves with Israel. There was very little aliyot. One Israeli diplomat is quoted in my book saying, bringing up aliyot among American Jews is like asking whether or not the bride is a virgin. It's just something that wasn't done. It was some very bad taste. Fewer than 5% of American Jews moved to Israel, and the Israelis were always rather bitter about this. They never stopped saying that the only place you could be fully Jewish was Israel. And there was a constant argument about this, and the American Jewish Committee was always trying to get Ben Gurion to stop saying that, and he'd agree because he needed the money, and then he would say it the next day, and it never ended. I would say it's, you can still hear a lot of it today. Now, this changed radically in 1967. In 1967, this idea of Israel, which had been a very distant idea, it had been kind of a Jewish Disneyland. I think I quote Jonathan Sarna saying that. A Disneyland in which Jews and Arabs lived in harmony, one in which all of the Arabs who had left Israel left voluntarily because they heard radio broadcasts that told them to leave. I'm swallowing half my words. I'm sorry. All right, I'll try and do better. I didn't want to be too close to the camera because my face is too big, but I'll try and do better. This mythical Israel, which is most evident in Leon Uris's book Exodus and the movie Exodus, which people took to heart incredibly impressively, although you didn't really see that until '67. They kept it at a distance, but they had a very romantic idea of it. If you had told them some of the things that were going on in Israel, that there was a Nakba, that all of the Palestinian Israelis who remained were living under martial law, that in fact those families who had been kicked out by the IDF in the 1948 war, by the way, the IDF took responsibility for, in a document I found, for expelling 700,000 Arabs, which is about how many left. We don't really know the numbers. Their property was all expropriated according to a law in 1950. Basically, Israel said, we have no responsibility at all for the refugees and for the Palestinians. They're the responsibility of the Arabs. And this position was never accepted by any other country, really. Certainly not the United States State Department. But the Israelis stuck to it, and there wasn't really anything anybody could do about it. And American Jews basically bought it. The idea that there was no Nakba, that Israel wanted peace, and the Arab world wouldn't give it to them. This went unquestioned. But it wasn't important. It wasn't important. It wasn't a matter of identity, I guess is the main point that I'm trying to make here. And then in 1967, that fundamentally changed. I'm not gonna do much quoting here. I'm just gonna quote one paragraph from my book here. So 1967, there was this fear that there was going to be a second Holocaust. People were quoting Nasser saying he wanted to throw the Jews into the sea, which, by the way, there's no evidence he said, but there's a lot of other quotes that sound just as threatening, and you didn't really need that quote. It's just interesting to me that the one that one always hears was probably made up. And then, of course, there was this fantastic victory. It took 6 days, coincidentally. Both reform and conservative rabbis who had never talked about divine intervention in humankind as a thing that happens on a day-to-day basis began to speak as if God had reached his or her hand into this moment. And here is one paragraph from the book. In a remarkably prescient article published in Commentary, by the way, Commentary was quite anti-Zionist for much of its history. Commentary, the New York Times, and the State Department all shared a similar position on Israel. In a remarkably prescient article published in Commentary just weeks after the war, Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg noted that the crisis had united American Jews, quote, with deep Jewish commitments that they had never been united before, and it has evoked such commitments in many Jews who previously seemed untouched by them. A much admired scholar of Jewish history, as well as a congregational rabbi, Hertzberg could find, quote, no conventional Western theological terms with which to explain this. Rather, he found that most contemporary, again, quote, most contemporary Jews experience these emotions without knowing how to define them, as Israel had become, quote, the very strong focus of worldwide Jewish emotional loyalty, and therefore as a preservative of a sense of Jewish identity. He wrote this minutes after the war. Time would prove the accuracy of these predictions as, quote, terror and dread, as Abraham Joshua Heschel put it, metamorphosed into exultation among American Jews in the immediate aftermath of the war. So this is the beginning of what my friend, scholar and rabbi Shaul McGee calls the Zionization of American Jewry. And Shaul has written, the Jewish discourse about Zionism became Jewish identity itself. Zionism now defined Jewish legitimacy. It was, quote, no longer part of a larger conversation, it defined the conversation. So the embrace of Israel as the fundamental center of American Jewish identity had an enormous number of implications. And I can't do justice to all of them in this talk. That's why the book is 500 pages. But one implication it had is it created enormous tension between the liberalism of American Jews and the support for Israel, because Israel acted in ways that were not always consistent with that and with American liberalism, American Jewish liberalism, and one sometimes had to make a choice. And rarely, if ever, did Israel lose in that contest. There were some attempted organizations, Jewish organizations, that attempted to try and marry their commitment to liberalism with their support for and love for Israel. The most prominent of these in the 1970s was an organization called Brera, which was started by both rabbis and lay Jews that began to talk about the need for Palestinian dignity and state. They got some good publicity for a while, but then were eventually undermined by the willingness of some of their members to meet with people who were associated with the PLO, which that was outside of the boundaries of what was considered acceptable at the time. One interesting footnote to this story of Brera before it fell apart is that one of its leaders, I think maybe even the chairman of its board, was a man named Rabbi Arnold Jacob Wolf. And he disappeared into a congregation in Hyde Park, where years later, a couple by the name of Michelle and Barack Obama moved in across the street. And Barack Obama's understanding of Zionism owes an awful lot to his friendship with Rabbi Wolf. And he eulogized him quite beautifully when he died. And this is, I think, one reason why a lot of leaders of Jewish organizations didn't like Barack Obama. So the conflict between American Jewish liberalism and its support for Israel had a number of manifestations. Under Jimmy Carter, it led to enormous conflict between blacks and Jews over the forced resignation of Andrew Young, who also met with the PLO. That's a complicated story. Happy to talk about it, but ironically, he was meeting with the PLO to get the PLO's permission to tell the Arab nations not to bring an anti-Israel resolution, because he had the position of head of the Security Council. He was rotating into it, but that had a terrible effect on Black and Jewish relations when he was the most prominent Black member of Carter's cabinet, was forced out. When Ronald Reagan became president, and did very well in the Jewish vote, he came into power, and he had a big fight with organized Jewry over selling weapons, these sophisticated weapons, to Saudi Arabia called called AWACS. That's funny. And AIPAC, which before that had been a kind of a under the radar organization that mostly lobbied congressional staff and other members of Congress to support them sometimes against the will of the White House, but didn't really want to make it public. Again, there was always a concern about inspiring anti-Semitism. They became a powerhouse. They expanded tenfold. They started organizing grassroots branches all over the country. They started policing the media. They started placing people in jobs in not only in Congress, but in the State Department, Defense Department. They started making it difficult for people who didn't support Israel to get jobs. I would say that people don't like it when I say it. I'm willing to defend it later, but I'd say they have an awful lot in common. The organization that I grew into has an awful lot in common with the National Rifle Association. And the reason I say this is because Americans are broadly supportive of Israel, much more so than any other country. It's just like Americans like guns more than any other country does. But 92% of Americans want stricter gun control, and they don't get it. And I don't think that the degree of support for Israeli government action is consistent with what most Americans want. I can give you statistics that demonstrate that. It's actually not, it's no longer consistent with what American Jews want. We get to that later. It's much more consistent with what evangelical Christians want. Anyway, just to go through these eras. So you have this new world where you have many Jews becoming Jewish voices in the media are becoming neoconservative. You have conservatives coming to embrace Israel in a way they hadn't before. They were much more on the pro-Arab side until Israel became this military powerhouse. And then you have this enormously powerful organization working in Congress on behalf of Israel. And that's the way things were for quite a while, I would say, until the invasion of Lebanon in 1982. There was some nervousness when Menachem Begin became prime minister among American Jews because they liked the labor governments and they didn't really know what to make of Begin, but they still were unwilling to question Israel. With the invasion of Lebanon, a couple things happened. One was the siege of Beirut was a city where all the journalists were working. So they were seeing Israel behave in a way that shocked them. And then there was the Sabra and Shatila massacre, which the Israelis enabled. They didn't carry it out, but they enabled it. And this was also shocking to American journalists, particularly to Tom Friedman, who was the New York Times guy there, the most, then and now, the most influential writer about Israel and the Palestinians. And he went to Brandeis. He was a nice Jewish boy. He called himself a twice a year synagogue attender, but he couldn't believe what he saw. And he wrote the longest article in the world about what had happened at Sabra and Shatila. And of course, many Israeli Jews rose up and Menachem Begin had to resign and Ariel Sharon was discredited. And so American Jews at that point began to identify with Jewish dovishness, Peace Now, Amos Oz, Aleph Bet Yeshua. These were the people who the Peace Now generals would come and lecture in the United States, and the great writers, Oz, Yeshua, David Grossman. And this was able to perpetuate American Jewish connection to Israel, even as these Israelis became less and less representative of Israel itself. The second Intifada, the first Intifada, I guess we're not talking the second. The first Intifada continued this process. And what happened in that, two things happened there. One was Americans were horrified by Yitzhak Rabin, who had been understood to be one of the good guys, policy of instructing the IDF to break the bones of these young kids who were throwing rocks at the occupying forces. So the American journalists would go in and interview these kids in hospitals, and they would be in traction, and they were kids, and this didn't help. And then secondly, Nightline, it wasn't only Nightline, but Nightline spent a week in Jerusalem interviewing both Palestinians and Israelis, and they did this one show, I think it was a 3-hour show, I remember watching it, where they had 4 representatives of the Palestinians and 4 Israelis talk. It was separated by a wall because the Palestinians wanted it understood that they were not representing their people, because that was the job of the PLO, but they were people like Hanan Ashwari and Saad Erekat, people who were dressed well and spoke well, and they had doctorates, and they were lawyers, and they were not Yasser Arafat. They were not scary. They were very sympathetic figures. And nobody had seen that in the United States. Not nobody, but very few people had seen it. In fact, PBS ran the Nightline show after Nightline did, because it was such news. And the only news really was that these were people, and just like you and me. And they had what seemed like very reasonable claims. And that began to change the whole nature of the discourse. Now we had Oslo, and Oslo was great. I was actually on the lawn for the signature because of a friend of mine, and I cried. It was magnificent when Rabin said, we don't want to fight you anymore. But Oslo didn't work. The American Jewish organizations were very divided on Oslo. AIPAC didn't like it. Rabin's ambassador to the United States, Itamar Rabinovich, who had been my professor at Tel Aviv University, he got tomatoes thrown at him sometimes by Jews, because they were so upset that Israel was making these compromises. Commentary was totally anti-Oslo. And Oslo failed, because it turned out that the second Intifada destroyed the Israeli peace movement. So there's really been no mainstream peace movement in Israel since the second Intifada. People were not willing to, they stopped caring really about the Palestinians. The majority of Israelis did. We just had 5 elections in Israel, and leaving aside some of the shockingness of the last one, there was never any discussion of peace in any of those elections, because none of the major parties were willing to stake their case on it. So we've had, again, I'm giving you a shorthand. We've had a lot of events since then. 9/11, the Iraq War, Obama's presidency, where he was intentionally undermined in Congress by Bibi Netanyahu, nakedly allying Israel with the Republican Party, which of course continued much more explicitly under Donald Trump. So we ended up in a situation where Israel is the only country in the world only democratic country in the world that prefers Trump to Biden and Obama. And American Jews supported Biden and Obama by about 67 to 70%. So there's a real divergence of the way these two the two largest Jewish communities in the world, see the world. And in fact, it's much more intense at the level of young people than their parents and grandparents. The young American Jews are more liberal than their grandparents and parents, and Israeli young Israeli Jews are more right-wing than their parents and grandparents. American Jews are less attached. Young American Jews are less attached than their grandparents and their parents, etc. And now that we have this moment, what looks like to be a crisis between American Jews and Israel because of the nature of the new government. You know, in the 1980s, 1970s, you could have had maybe 25 prominent Jews signing a letter complaining about the government of Israel and saying it's not anti-Semitic to criticize it. And now you have 169. And most of those 25 you would have had back in 1982 would have been Jews like Noam Chomsky or Izzy Stone, people who were Jewish for the purpose of signing that article, not genuine, legitimate leaders of Israel. The idea of the Reform rabbinate saying, we don't want these ministers in our synagogues. These are things that were unthinkable not too long ago. The controversy over the letter written by the students that upset so many people in organized Jewry and many of their colleagues. And, again, these things were unimaginable not too long ago. But what I'm trying to explain in this book is how we got here. And usually when you give these talks, you're supposed to end, or write a book even, you're supposed to end on an optimistic note. So I am going to end on an optimistic note, but it's a weird one. My optimistic note is this. I get the need for a state of Israel in 1948. And I feel like the idea of anti-Zionism is a silly notion because Israel's not going anywhere. Zionism is about the creation of the state of Israel. There's a state of Israel. It's just like being anti-France. People say to me, are you a Zionist or an anti-Zionist? I used to call myself a liberal Zionist, but I think liberal Zionism is now a contradiction in terms. So I call myself an anti-Zionist because anti-Zionism is silly. Another word for that is liberal realist. But I don't have any hopes for peace in the Middle East. I do feel like Israel has embraced a set of values that I don't share. I don't see much hope for that part of Israel that does share my values. But I also think that American Jewry, and I don't know much about other nations' Jewry, but diaspora Jewry generally has paid a real price for making Israel the unchallenged focus of its identity. The Zionization of Israel, it made sense in my generation and maybe for a few generations afterwards. I certainly embraced it. I'm 63 years old, but young Jews don't embrace it. Now, as you all know, American Judaism is a crisis. If I'm not mistaken, and please do correct me if I am, conservative Judaism has lost about a third of its membership. Reform Jewry has lost just under 20%, but that number is inflated by some conservative Jews becoming Reform Jews. And there are a lot of reasons for this. I know intermarriage is usually the first one people turn to, but I think it has a lot to do with what young Jews are being offered. They're being told that to be a good Jew is to support Israel and to remember the Holocaust, which is actually part of supporting Israel, the way it's offered to them. And I think this doesn't work anymore. I think Israel is not the place that the people who are doing the talking imagine it to be, and American Jews know this, particularly young ones. And the result is they're not going to fight about it. It's just not going to be important to them. If this is what it means to be a Jew, they just won't be that Jewish anymore. And I think that's one of the main. I think that's what's happening. And I actually, like I said, I tried to stay out of this book for most of it. But at the end of the book, I say, I really care about the future of American Jewry. And what we have now is an opportunity to reconsider what it what it means to be a diaspora Jew, to think about it again. It was in crisis. Zionism saved American Jewry. It was I have a great quote here about it from Alexander Schindler, where he compares it to a kidney that American Jewry needed to operate. But now it's a source of division and a source of oftentimes endangerment. And so much resources, so much money, so much energy has gone towards supporting Israel among American Jews, that if we devoted a fraction of those resources to figuring out what it means to be a diaspora Jew today, why a young person should want to be Jewish who's not Orthodox, all of this leaves out the Orthodox. I think that would be very valuable. I have rabbi friends who say, actually, saving American Jewry is harder than peace with the Palestinians. That may be true, but I think it's worth saving. I think it's an incredibly rich tradition that I'm proud to see myself in. You know, I'm not an Israeli Jew. I didn't fight in any wars. I've never worked on the kibbutz. Well, I did for a summer, but that's not my identity. My identity is an American Jew. And I think, and I would like to be able to, I mean, I found my identity through scholarship and Torah study. I'm not a religious Jew, but I go to Torah study and I love it. It's been thrilling for me. And I love these Zoom conversations like that. But I don't know if that's an avenue for other people who are not inclined the way I am. But I think we need to consider that. So I think that if we admit that this vicarious identity seeking is no longer effective, and we ask ourselves, how can we reach people where they are and who they are, I think we can begin a new chapter of American Jewry that would have a future. Right now, I'm quite concerned about it. So that's my optimistic ending, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Eric. I mean, thank you, first of all, for your personal honesty. Thank you for your critical honesty. And you've given us a lot to think about. I'm going to share with you two comments that have been offered in the chat, which go, I think, in very different directions, but I think it's worth considering them together. So I'll read both. The first question: doesn't the fact that the peace movement was destroyed by the Second Intifada make total sense? If your kid is going to be blown up in a pizzeria, what else can you believe? So that's on the one side. Then another comment: originally, Israel was a refuge for Jews who were the persecuted minority. Now Israel is a place where Jews are the dominant majority that deals with the persecuted minority, Palestinians. This has changed the whole paradigm. Please discuss.
Yeah, well, again, a big problem with the discourse over Israel is, where do you begin the clock? So I was very critical, and I am very critical of the Walter Mearsheimer argument in the book, because I felt like I always begun the clock after the terrorist attack, right before Israel's response. And so if you begin to talk about the Second Intifada, if you begin the discussion with the blowing up of a pizza parlor, sure. I mean, I have a daughter who goes to pizza parlors. I get that, but of course, it's a part of a much longer story. And look, who among us? I've actually been inside a Palestinian refugee camp. One thing about this book, by the way, which is another reason that nobody is going to agree with all of it, is it's very critical of the Palestinians as well. But I've been inside a Palestinian refugee camp, and it's the worst place I've ever been in my life. In fact, my life was threatened inside that refugee camp. A man held a club over my head and said, "Are you a Jew?" Very unpleasant moment in my life. Maybe the worst one I ever had. But in that refugee camp, which it had open sewage, the kids had snot coming out of their nose, they had holes in their clothes, there were no schools to speak of. So when I was there, it was right after the first Intifada. It was 1988. So those people were the grandchildren of the people who had been forced out of their homes. And now those people's grandchildren are living in the same refugee camp. And as far as we can tell, so will their grandchildren. So if you live like that, and you look at it from the perspective who again have terrible situation with Gaza, which is an open air prison. Now, again, you can argue about who exactly is responsible, depending on when you start the clock. You can see how their frustration bubbles into irrational acts of terrorism. Doesn't mean you support it, God forbid, but it's understandable that hopelessness and nihilism breeds this kind of reaction. So the way to address these threats is to find a way to give them some hope. Now, I don't actually blame Israel. People come to me and say, whose fault is it? And I say, well, 75% Israel's fault and 25% Palestinians' fault. It's 75% Israel's fault because they have everything and the Palestinians have nothing. So if you're going to trade, the people who have everything have to give the people who have nothing something. On the one hand. On the other hand, the Palestinians have been terrible at politics from minute one. They could have had a majority that would have been they could have had a firm majority in the 1920s when the British offered them again in the 30s. They refused to cooperate with the UN in 1947, even to meet with the Special Committee on Palestine. I used to be friendly with Edward Said. He was my professor for one semester, and I got to know him. And he told me that during the Camp David agreement, Cyrus Vance sent him to see Yasser Arafat in Beirut and said, we will recognize the PLO and bring them into the negotiations if PLO will recognize Israel, as Egypt has done. And Said wouldn't even see him. Now, and again, the offer that Ehud Barak made with Jimmy Carter in 2000 wasn't nearly as good as people like to think it was, but they still should have taken it because look what they have now. Now, to be fair, there's two problems with what I just said if you were a Palestinian. One is that I'm asking them to see the future, and nobody can do that. But number two, and here's where, God forbid, I have not sympathy for Arafat, but I understand his position when he refused these things. The Palestinians have numerous different constituencies. They have the people I talk about in these refugee camps. They have the people living under occupation. They have the people living in Israel under various forms of discrimination. They have Palestinian diaspora working in the oil fields in the Gulf. They have a few Palestinians who live really lovely lives. It's professors and businessmen all over the world. And then they have the whole Arab world that lays claim to, the whole Muslim world that lays claim to the holy places in Jerusalem. When Arafat was done negotiating with Clinton and Barak, he was told by the Saudis and the Egyptians, you cannot make this deal. We will not allow this deal to be made. And those people weren't even Palestinians. They were just speaking about not getting enough of Jerusalem. So it's impossible those people have conflicting needs. And the only way you can unite them is by saying no. So it's true. And particularly if you look at Hamas, this is the other card Israel has to play. If you look at Hamas and you look at the Palestinian Authority, they do have no one to negotiate with. The Palestinian Authority is corrupt. It can't deliver anything. And Hamas is Hamas. But I think Israel bears enormous responsibility for creating this structure. And that's why I'm reluctant to say, how can you make peace with these people? They are people. They're a lot of very good, very decent people who, the metaphor that Amos Oz used is that Israel, the Jews jumped out of a burning building and landed on top of the Palestinians. And Edward Said used to say, we're the victims of victims. So they're living a very different reality. And if you look at it from their reality, it's horrific. So that's what's necessary, the only way that Israel can live in peace and can stop worrying about attacks like we saw last week is to create a situation where the Palestinians can also live in peace and dignity. and are not led to these nihilistic attacks, but they're doing the opposite.
Yeah. We've got a very interesting question here about the contemporary setting of the current discussion. Do you think that the ability of young people to connect with others around the world and hear a range of opinion about Israel and communicate with Palestinian young people and young people from Arab countries has this possibility of contact communication? What kind of impact has that had on the views of those who in the past didn't hear these other voices?
Well, I talk about that toward the end of the book a lot. For the longest time, AIPAC and neoconservatives policed the discourse so that anyone who took a position critical of Israel was branded as an anti-Semite or a self-hating Jew. Noam Chomsky is an obvious example, but there were many. I mean, Jimmy Carter was, and even Steven Spielberg was, and Barack Obama was too. And that control of the discourse has fundamentally changed for two reasons. One is that social media has made information of all kinds available to everyone. So no matter what your viewpoint is, you can get social media that will reinforce that viewpoint, will give you, like I said, it's very hard to change anyone's mind, but people are very happy to get media that reinforces what they already believe, and there's plenty of that. But also the mainstream media, it's still, I think, pro-Israel by and large. I know that statement will sound controversial, but read the book. I got a lot of data in there. But there are things in there that are shocking to people. Nevertheless, the New York Times is by far and away the most important source. It's much more pro-Israel than its competitors in other countries. It's more pro-Israel than Le Monde is. It's more pro-Israel than The Guardian is. It's way more pro-Israel than Haaretz is. But it did show you the faces of 69 children who were killed in the war against Hamas in 2021. It did show you. It made a film about what it meant to be living under occupation. Abe Foxman said, after 60 years, I'm canceling my subscription. The head of the Simon Wiesenthal Foundation said it was the newspaper of Hamas. But it reflects the divisions among its readership, which is largely Jewish. New York Times is a Jewish tribal drum. There's a quote in this book that I love where when the editor of the Forward, Jody Gregorian, got the job, she went to Ben Smith, who was the New York Times media correspondent at the time, also a alumnus of the Forward, and said, I want to create a Jewish New York Times. And Ben said, the New York Times is the Jewish New York Times. It always has been. In the beginning, it was run by, I don't really shouldn't get into this. It was anti-Semitic and anti-Israel, run by an anti-Jewish, genuinely self-hating Jew. And it was very anti-Israel, but it changed. And ever since the 1960s, it's been very pro-Israel by and large. And so people are shocked when they see things that are inconsistent with that, and they're seeing them more and more. But, most American Jews are quite critical of Israel now, or the majority of them are. Maybe not most, but it's about 50-50. About 50% take the view that AIPAC takes, and about slightly more take the view that J Street takes. But the power in the political system remains almost entirely with AIPAC. So actually, nobody's asked this, but I always get asked this, and I think it's useful to explain. People often say that the Democratic Party is becoming anti-Israel or less enamored in Israel, and that in the future, Israel will have a lot more to worry about politically in this country. And I say, I'm not so sure that's clear. It's definitely clear that young Democrats who used to be pro-Israel are now more pro-Palestinian than pro-Israel. And the Democratic Party itself is split in half now. But in 2021, when Israel used up about $1 billion worth of Iron Dome missiles And the United States had already committed itself in a commitment that I think is unprecedented in all of diplomatic history. It had committed itself under Barack Obama to give Israel $38 billion worth of aid over the next 10 years. It's American law. It can't be changed except by a new law. This terrible anti-Israel president, Barack Obama, did that. So then Congress said, well, let's give Israel an extra billion because they used up theirs. What was the vote? The vote was 529 to 8, with one abstention. AOC was the abstention. So for all the talk of the Democrats turning against Israel, they're not turning against Israel. Now, there's a complicated dynamic here, and we're running out of time, and I talk about it in the book, but I think that there is definitely a crisis underway between American Jews and Israel, but there is not a crisis in the American political system between America and Israel. And that's a very interesting, complicated dynamic there.
Okay, very interesting. Again, thank you so much. And there's a lot more to discuss. People obviously will be on various sides of any of the many questions you raised, and that's good. It allows us to engage in discussion. I always give authors an opportunity to, do you have a preferred, place for people to buy your book? People know how to buy books these days, but is there a place that you prefer, or just wherever they can find it?
Well, anybody can buy my book. I'm happy to have them buy it. They can come to my apartment and I'll give them a deal. But if you click on the Basic Book site, Basic Books as a publisher, it offers you a whole set of choices. I like people to buy books from the indie sites or their local bookstore more than I like them to buy from Amazon. But you can make your own choices. If you just put in your computer, Eric Alterman Basic Books, the book will come up and you can click on whatever you want there.
Great. Okay.
But thank you.
Very good. So thank you so much, really, for engaging us in very important, thoughtful discussion. And I want to just thank you all for coming. Please look for other book talks upcoming. There are a variety on our calendar. If you're here, it means you're on our mailing list, and you will get notices of that. Some very, very interesting pieces that I am quite sure you will enjoy. So look forward to seeing you again. Please be in touch with me at the library at JTS if you have anything you'd like to follow up with. And this will appear on the JTS website. The recording will, so anyone who hasn't had a chance to tune in this evening will have a chance going forward. Good night, and thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, David.